After the failed attempt to capture Ismailia, Israel tried to consolidate its position west of the canal and try to exert pressure on Egypt before a ceasefire took full effect. Adan's division was ordered to quickly move south and take Suez and use it as a strategic leverage. The fall of such an important city would have been a significant blow to Egyptian morale. On the 23rd, Adan's company arrived at Suez and made a weak attack, which was held, and so the Israeli first attempt to enter Suez was balked. On the 24th, Adan chose to attack the city again, using a tank unit and a paratrooper battalion. They openly advanced along the wide main boulevard into the city, only to be fired upon suddenly from the buildings on either side of the roadway. They were surrounded, and the armored column was ambushed and severely hit. Within 20 minutes, 20 of the 24 Israeli tank commanders of the column, who were exposed in their turrets, were killed or wounded. The Israelis had not expected such stiff resistance. The Israelis admit to suffering 80 casualties in this abortive battle and to losing 11 tanks, 17 armored personnel carriers, and some trucks. Having failed to occupy the center of Suez, the Israelis now began to withdraw their forces to the outskirts of the city. On the 25th, the Israelis made their third attack on Suez at about 8 a.m. This time, they used one of their Soviet squadrons of some 15 Tiran tanks, supported by infantry in civilian-impressed trucks. Although the fighting continued until about 1550, the Israelis could not break through into the center of the city and had to withdraw with the loss of 10 tanks. Suez, formerly a city of some 200,000, was now partitioned down the main street. The Egyptians held the center of the city, while the Israelis controlled the outskirts. The Egyptians admit that by this time, the road from Cairo to Suez was blocked at kilometer 101. The Israelis claim that on the 26th, the day that marked the end of Ramadan, they had completely encircled the Third Army, scattered leaflets over it, and called on it to surrender. On the other hand, the Egyptians claim that their army, local militia, and civilians were besieging the Israeli pocket on the West Bank. On the 28th, despite the second ceasefire, the Israelis made their fourth and last attack on Suez. Starting at 6 a.m., it lasted for only an hour and was also unsuccessful. At the same time, they tried to push southward to outflank the small Egyptian pocket, but were halted by Egyptian frontier troops. Egyptian rangers and other troops in small sections were in and among the Israelis, passing back information about them. The Israeli pocket was surrounded by 3 tank and 2 mechanized divisions. Regarding territory taken or lost on the Suez Canal front, the Israelis claimed they had crossed over the west bank of the canal, although they admitted there were many Egyptian pockets within that area and were also surrounded by Egyptian forces. The Egyptians had gained and held about 300 square miles on the east bank, but their Third Army was surrounded. However, at the Israeli Symposium on the Yom Kippur War held in Jerusalem in October 1975, Colonel Trevor Dupuy stated that it was clear that Brigadier Badari and his Third Army were not on the verge of collapse. Dupuy's perspective highlights the resilience of the Egyptian Third Army and argued that it maintained its combat integrity and defensive positions east of the Suez Canal. Further, Drew Middleton, military editor of the New York Times, wrote, "The Egyptian Third Army did not break. They were still in being, and their continued existence posed a strategic challenge for Israel." The situation was as much a stalemate as it was a siege, although the Israelis did not like to see it that way. Some supplies were flown in at night to the Third Army by helicopter or brought across by boat, and water was obtained from the Ain Musa Springs. Since October 28, 1973, the Egyptian General Command decided not to allow the Israeli forces west of the canal any period of calm or rest, and to prevent them from consolidating their defenses or fortifying them in engineering terms, and to tighten the noose around them in close cooperation with all the surrounding forces. The active defensive actions of Egyptian forces developed to the point that some called this phase Egypt's Second War of Attrition. The Second War of Attrition with Israel began on November 1, 1973, and lasted until March 17, 1974. During these months, there were almost daily incidents of shelling, skirmishes, and patrol raids in the Third Army sector. Edgar O'Ballance, British military journalist, mentioned that there was frequent Israeli aircraft action against the besieged army. The Israelis were trying desperately, for prestige reasons alone, to force it to surrender, but they failed. Also, holding out on the East Bank during this period was the besieged Kabrit fort, which the Israelis also tried hard to force to surrender, subjecting it to constant artillery fire and bombing. The Egyptians consider the defense of Kabrit fort, taken in 30 minutes and defended for 3 months, to be one of their war epics in which the water shortage was overcome by boiling and vaporizing salt water from the canal. On the West Bank, the Israelis settled themselves in defensive positions and surrounded themselves with mines. Later, the Egyptian Engineer Corps claimed to have lifted 750,000 mines, mainly of US origin, which had been laid in the Israeli pocket. On 9 December, the Egyptians announced that the Israeli pocket was only 3 miles deep and not 10 as claimed by the Israelis, and that there was a plan prepared to encircle and destroy the pocket using 5 divisions and 20 Ranger units. The war of attrition between Egypt and Israel dragged on, although much was hidden from the Israeli nation by military censorship. The shock of being caught by surprise, the failure to capture key strategic cities along the canal, and the huge but as yet unknown casualty figures and the lack of information about missing soldiers and prisoners caused the people to devolve into bitter recrimination as anger overtook fear. The famous Jewish psychologist Richard Lazarus addressed the International Association of Psychologists at its yearly convention in Tel Aviv in 1975. The Israelis are living in a continuous state of trauma. This was the first war that didn't strengthen Israel, as it was a psychological disaster in so much that it destroyed the legend of the invincible army. The biggest danger was replacing this idea by the fear of being under threat at all times. Something was broken at the Yom Kippur War. The state was saved, but our faith is lost. Our confidence is broken, and our hearts are torn, as we almost lost a full generation. A few days after the ceasefire, the Egyptian Armored Corps rushed a large number of tanks to surround the Israeli pocket after repairing and equipping them. In addition to 140 more tanks that had arrived in Egypt from Algeria, 150 tanks that had arrived from Yugoslavia, and 250 tanks that had arrived late from Russia. Thus, Egypt had about 800 tanks that surrounded the Israeli forces west of the canal, which included 400 tanks that had crossed after the ceasefire on October 22nd. The Israelis found themselves caught in a layered entrapment. While they besieged Egypt's Third Army, they were themselves surrounded by Egyptian forces. What had begun as a bold breakthrough was now turning into a trap. Their conditions and their administrative lines were extremely critical at this point. For the Egyptians, the opportunity was ripe. This time, there was no water barrier or fortified defensive line to hinder their advance. The Egyptian forces around them were in a position that did not allow the Israelis to move or deploy to improve their situation, nor did they even allow them to withdraw from their positions without major losses. The Egyptians had already formulated a plan to eliminate the Israeli incursion west of the canal. The objective was clear: to decisively destroy all Israeli forces west of the canal and restore the situation to its state prior to the Israeli breach. This offensive plan was given the code name Shamel, which means comprehensive, and was entrusted to Major General Saad Mamoun in December 13th. In his memoirs, General Saad Mamoun stated, "The enemy lacks strategic balance. Their forces are trapped west of the canal and have failed to push ours back even an inch on the eastern front. Every ration, every drop of water, every artillery shell, every liter of fuel had to travel over 300 kilometers to reach their forces west of the canal through a narrow corridor just 6 kilometers wide. Our plan was to seal off that passage and turn it into a corridor of fire while simultaneously annihilating the enemy forces in the west. It would have taken no time. The Bar-Lev line taught us that no matter how fortified a position is, it can still be breached. Imagine what we could have done when their forces were completely exposed." In his autobiography, Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan stated that the ceasefire existed on paper, but the continued firing along the front was not the only characteristic of the situation between 24 October 1973 and 18 January 1974. This intermediate period also held the ever-present possibility of a renewal of full-scale war. There were 3 variations on how it might break out: 2 Egyptian and 1 Israeli. One Egyptian plan was to attack Israeli units west of the canal from the direction of Cairo. The other was to cut off the Israeli canal bridgehead by a link-up of the 2nd and 3rd Armies on the East Bank. Both plans were based on massive artillery pounding of Israeli forces who were not well fortified and who would suffer heavy casualties. It was therefore thought that Israel would withdraw from the West Bank, since they were most sensitive on the subject of soldiers' lives. Egypt, at the time, had a total of 1,700 first-line tanks on both sides of the canal front, 700 on the East Bank and 1,000 on the West Bank. Also on the West Bank, in the second line, were an additional 600 tanks for the defense of Cairo. They had some 2,000 artillery pieces, about 500 operational aircraft, and at least 130 SAM missile batteries positioned around our forces so as to deny us air support. U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger intervened decisively to prevent the implementation of Egypt's plan, a fact he later confirmed in his personal memoirs. The Israeli pocket west of the Suez Canal had effectively become a trap, and Kissinger's visit to Egypt on November 1, 1973, highlighted the gravity of the situation. During their meeting, President Anwar Sadat outlined the reality to Kissinger, stating, "I have 800 tanks compared to Israel's 400, and for every Israeli tank, I have 1.5 missiles. The Israelis are confined to a strip only 6.5 kilometers wide east of the canal. If we attack, their forces will be annihilated without question." Kissinger acknowledged that he was well aware of the situation. He revealed that the Pentagon had provided him with satellite imagery confirming the reactivation of Egypt's air defense system, along with detailed views of the amassed Egyptian tanks, artillery, and other preparations. But he delivered a stark warning to Sadat. Any attempt to eliminate Israeli forces west of the canal would escalate the situation beyond the Middle East. "We cannot allow a Soviet-backed offensive to succeed against an American-supported position." At 9 o'clock on the morning of January 17, 1974, Cairo time, the separation of forces agreement between Egypt and Israel was broadcast under the supervision of the United Nations. This agreement was put into effect as of 12 o'clock on January 25th. Israel began withdrawing its forces from the agreed-upon areas, and the separation of forces proceeded in accordance with the agreement. Both sides gained advantages and suffered disadvantages, the Egyptians perhaps gaining far more than the Israelis. The Egyptians gained some 300 square miles of Israeli-held Sinai on the east bank of the canal since October 6, 1973. They destroyed and captured the Bar-Lev Line, the strongest fortification the world had seen since World War II. The Israelis lost the military superiority they had enjoyed over the Arabs for so long, and their military power alone was no longer great enough to deter Arab attacks. From subsequent negotiations, the Israelis were pushed back deep into the Sinai, and ultimately Egypt regained control over all of its occupied territories in the Sinai. The greatest Arab gain, perhaps, from the war was the fact that the haunting specter of the Israeli invincibility was shattered. Sadat went to war not for territorial gain, but to create a crisis that would disrupt the status quo, open the way for negotiations, and increase Egypt's diplomatic flexibility, and he succeeded. Golda Meir acknowledged as much in her memoirs, where she conceded that Sadat's conduct of the war and overtures to the United States put Egypt in a far stronger position diplomatically than Israel. The Yom Kippur War reshaped the Middle East in profound ways. It shattered the myth of Israeli invincibility, restored a sense of dignity and confidence to Egypt and the broader Arab world, and triggered a shift in global diplomacy. For Egypt, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that moved beyond years of tension and military confrontation. The war became a turning point, opening the door to peace and development.